Hello from Blades Music. Today's video is going to be about EQ and which EQ should I use. With all of the different options out there, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out which one you should be using for a particular function. So I'm going to go into that in this video coming up next. So with the number of plugins that are out there of all sorts and prices and variations and visuals and all of that kind of stuff, EQ is one that can be a little overwhelming to get into. There are tons of different options, built-in and purchasable, that have different types of controls, different kinds of emulations, some simple, some not so simple, and it can be a little daunting to get your head around which one should I be using. I'm going to be doing a series of videos on different EQs as well as compressors. So if you want to be reminded of those, if you'll click that subscribe button down there, that will do one part of that. But then also click the notification bell. Being subscribed doesn't just automatically notify you when new videos are out. It just lets you peruse the library of videos. So if you click the notification bell and you subscribe, then you'll get notified when I put something out that's new. Hopefully you like this video and the series that comes out of it. So I wanted to cover just a couple of areas. On this one, which EQ should I use? It has to be the first question that you ask yourself in order to make any sense out of the additional information about how to use one of those EQs. So I want to cover a couple of things. One is going to be, are you going to be using a standalone EQ or one that's part of a channel strip? And are you going to be use one that's built in or a third party to the DAW that you own? So let's talk about a couple of reasons why you would be using EQ to start with, right? So most of the time we think about EQ as a way to balance a mix, like to figure out where in the sound spectrum our instruments fit, to boost or cut frequencies that are either not present enough or are annoying. In the case of, something like the ring on a snare drum or the sound of a room that you're trying to maybe reduce in a vocal, if you didn't have the most pristine recording situations, those kinds of things that are annoying, or trying to bring out something more in a recorded source, like a kick drum that doesn't have quite enough body to it. You might want to boost a little bit of lows, and as long as there's low-end content there, you can accentuate that content and make that kick drum sound a little bit bigger. EQ being one of the ways to do that. Another thing you might be using it for is sound design. And when I say sound design, I don't mean so much like making special effects and things, though I mean you can probably take EQ as a piece of that process. I'm talking about more like things like, if you think about something like ELO's telephone line as a really simple example of that, where there's a very mid-range accentuated vocal that is made to sound like it's on an old telephone. And when that song came out, even then, phones didn't sound as thin and mid-rangey as that sound on the record did.
Hello, how are you? Have you been alright?
But when you listened to it, even then, you knew what they were trying to get across because it just exaggerated that sound. Same sort of a thing, like if you're trying to get the sound of music coming from another room, you'd probably cut a whole lot of the highs off, probably shelf the highs off starting in the mid-range, or maybe even a little bit lower than that, where all you kind of hear is a very muffled tone. And you can use that EQ to do tricks like make it sound like you're walking towards that room and opening doors and whatnot by bringing some of that high end back in manually or through automation or whatever. So a couple of different reasons why you might be using EQ, and some of that will drive your decision as to why you choose which EQ that you choose. So if you're talking about standalone versus a channel strip, all channel strips are going to have EQ of some sort in there. Standalone EQs are obviously going to be their own thing, but depending upon what your exact purpose is, will kind of drive why you would be using one over the other. For example, an EQ usually sits somewhere in the middle of a channel strip between the input controls and the output controls. Somewhere in there you probably have a compressor, might be before or after that EQ, so you might want the EQ to be completely outside of that, maybe even going before or after a channel strip, in addition to the one that's in the channel strip. Using a channel strip for it, on the other hand, is going to make it feel more like a console. You're going to have all of the pieces and parts right there in a line together, and the ability to control all of those things feeding into one another, which also can make a difference. There might be a reason why you want to EQ it and feed that into a compressor, or compress something and feed that into the EQ. Either way, a channel strip might be a good fit for that. Now, whether you're using a built-in or third-party also plays into this. I'm going to stick to mostly built-in stuff here to start with, but on the screen you can see a couple examples of what I'm talking about. So here on channel 2, you can see that I've assembled a number of different plugins, and these are all native Studio One except for the saturation knob at the end, which is a freebie that comes from Softtube. And what I've done here is basically assemble a channel strip. Over here on the channel number 4, I've got the fat channel, which is built into Studio One. And in the fat channel, we have a high-pass filter, an EQ, a compressor, and a limiter at the end of that. And you can change out any one of those modules for different emulations within the fat channel. And then here on channel 3, you can see that I have a console 1. That's a third-party thing, of course. That's got its own plugins, and that's a whole channel strip environment as well. So within each of these, you've got kind of different capabilities. So I just want to go real quickly into a couple examples here. So we're going to pull the EQ on each of these. So in the case of the standalone ones, I'm going to be using, these are again Studio One. Whatever DAW you're using certainly has a bunch of built-in stuff, whether it's Cakewalk or Cubase or Reaper or Studio One or Samplitude, whatever you, Samplitude, yeah, whatever. It's going to have its own built-in sequence of things. They're going to have various different qualities and whatnot. I'm going to be sticking to the Studio One versions. Apply this to your DAW as needed. So here, if I double click on my Pro EQ, you can see this is the sort that has a very readable graph on the screen where you can see visually what you're looking at. You can also see, if I copy this over here to this channel, you can see that there's an active curve of the audio itself that I'm speaking into, and you can kind of see where my voice is accentuated or not. So leaving that off, I'm going to go back over here to channel 2. The idea with this kind of an EQ is it's not meant to emulate anything in particular. It's very easy to look at. It's easy to use. You can see the different frequency bands. You can see how they react. You can change things like their width, which is called Q, like this. You can change what frequency they're at. You can change their, addition or subtraction of those frequencies. There's a lot of different options that you have that are really readily available. And especially for somebody not super familiar with EQ, these guys are great because it's very easy to see, especially when you put that spectrum monitor looking thing on there, where you can really see where the frequencies are and you can get a good idea for what needs to be boosted or cut. Of course, as your ears get better and better, you can identify those frequencies pretty readily anyway. So that is the example of the Pro EQ. And of course, I will be going into each of these in depth later. Over here on the fat channel, so double click on this one, you can see here in the middle I have an extra one plugged in there, but I'm going to go back to the standard one. And so here in the middle, let me take the stack out of here so we're looking at less. You can see we basically have the same thing. We do have very similar types of controls that you can, drag your little nodes around, change your cues and whatnot. I don't want to screw up what this all sounds like, so we're going to be turning these guys off as we go. So that's another example of the EQ. What I was talking about as far as other EQs that you could plug into this spot, depending upon what you have as far as the subscription or purchases or whatever you're using. I'm using Persona Sphere, which includes the whole fat channel collection. So I've got every EQ and every compressor available. And in here you've got a bunch of additional things. What comes with the fat channel is the standard, the passive, and the vintage, right? So we're talking about like a Pultec and a some kind of a, I guess this one's a Neve EQ. But then you've also got, some additional ones like the Alpine, the Baxendal, the RC500, which is actually a Personas hardware product, Solar 69. Each one of these is emulating another EQ that's from the physical real world. So like you could look at this Tube EQ, and I'm pretty sure this is a Tube Tech that it's emulating. And so they have different controls and they have different functions, but they generally do the same things. They just emulate a certain particular EQ. Now you might like the sound of that EQ. You may like the way the controls work. Maybe you physically have used that before. Maybe you were just playing around with it and thought that it was more fun to look at, or to, you liked the way that it sounded on a particular track that you were using. That's the great thing about having access to all of these tools now. That, if we went and bought all of this stuff in a real physical studio, it would be just outrageously expensive. But here we have the opportunity to kind of figure out which hardware we kind of like. Or what hardware we like the sound of. So these are just some other examples of EQs. And so the other example that I want to give here is the console 1. So I'm going to turn that on this channel, and you can see this middle section here is the EQ piece on that. Now this has physical hardware controls, so I can actually adjust my frequencies and my gains and everything with knobs. I'm not using the mouse, so you can see I'm kind of manipulating this stuff around. I'm changing my Q. I'm going to give that a boost there. And of course that would be a ridiculous boost, but we can also do a cut there. And in this case, it happens to be the British Class A or a Neve emulation. We could switch that up. In the case of console 1, there's a bunch of options, and you can see this is the built-in 4000E console, so that has the same sorts of controls, but in this case it's less stepped, which is kind of nice. And you have those same kinds of features that you have in the regular EQ. The difference is that this one comes in a channel strip. One of the things that's nice about this particular channel strip is the gain section at the end, or the drive section over here on the far right. There's some EQ character that happens just as a matter of turning on that drive. So I usually turn that up first. And if you turn on the drive, you can also adjust the character. And in the case of the way the character works, is 0 is just kind of, right in the middle. But turning that up accentuates that drive towards the high end. Turning it down accentuates the drive on the low end. So on a bass, you might put that drive towards the low end to get a little bit of extra fur, if you will, on the low end of the bass. You could, of course, go the other direction and put some drive on the high end of a bass and have the bottom end be real clean. Lots of different options. But again, that's getting outside of EQ, but it does affect how you use the EQ, having something like this following it in the mix. So again, this is kind of an introductory video into how you choose which EQ you're going to use. Find what your purpose in your EQ is and use the EQ that matches it. simple example here, if I wanted to do something very surgical and not musical, right? If I wasn't looking to overall affect a particular part to make, say a bunch of voices sound, a little bit brighter or something like that, but instead I was trying to remove a problem area, I would probably use something like the Pro EQ. And I might even say, I'm going to take that Pro EQ and I'm going to stick it in front of the channel strip, right? In this case, the console 1. Take the Pro EQ and make it so that maybe it has a cut right here in the middle that needs to happen. So I put that Pro EQ there and I cut it. And then when I use my channel strip, I've already gotten that problem area removed, and I can use my EQ and my compressor to get a better sound out of the recording and not just do something surgical with it. So choosing which EQ is really a lot about knowing what you're going for ahead of time. Don't just pick an EQ and start throwing it on stuff, because in the end, what's going to happen is you probably wind up with something that sounds unlike what you were expecting. So I hope that this video has been a good introduction to, how you would choose an EQ. And like I said, we're going to go into a little bit more depth on what each one of these EQs is capable of doing, with some audio examples to go along with them. If you want to follow that, subscribing to the channel and clicking that reminder is going to be the best way to keep up with when those videos come out. If you like this video or share it with somebody else, I'd appreciate that as well. Help me feed that Google algorithm. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video. Hope to see you on another one coming up soon. Have a good one.